I'm Leslie Glustrom, and I'm a biochemist by training, and I resigned my job about 5 years ago to work full-time on climate change issues. So I now work in Colorado, but increasingly at the national level, as we work to sort of accelerate the transition to the post-fossil fuel world. If you're thinking about climate change, you have to think about carbon dioxide. Largest source of carbon dioxide are coal plants. So we also want to be thinking about how to decarbonize our electric system. Here today we've been talking a lot about how to get to 100% renewables and how can we do it quickly. And one of my points that I've been trying to make is that this isn't a marketplace, unfortunately. When we talk about electricity, we're talking about monopolies. So we have to understand how those decisions are made and where they're made. And they're made primarily in utilities commissions in 50 states. And so it's very important to guys do what I call roll up your sleeves, lift up the hood, and figure out how those decisions are made, and then try to get them shifted so that we don't lose yet another century, which is really what we've had as these monopolies have time and time again driven decisions that are in line with their interests, but not in line with the planet's interests, not in line with ratepayers' interests, not in line with our economy's interests. So that all requires policy work. And I primarily work at the state and increasingly at the national level on that. Just in general, I bring in the same thing that a lot of people bring, which is sort of the fierce urgency. And I think even maybe going a step beyond that is that we just cannot fail. Failure is not an option, which means that we have to be just profoundly serious about analyzing what's going on, understanding it, and then taking the most effective actions we can take to turn around the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our country, which is coal-fired power plants, burning a trainload of coal, typically a full trainload of coal every day getting turned into carbon dioxide. If you really comprehend that, and 600 coal plants around the country, you start to understand why carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is doing this, because we're taking a geologic store of carbon, oxidizing it at a mind-boggling rate in power plants that are less than 30% efficient. So I really bring a focus on coal and coal plants and on the regulatory decisions and on the kind of power that the electric utility and the coal industry and the whole big conglomerate that you might call the power empire, why they keep us just basically addicted to this stuff. And as part of that, I bring a really, having done a really detailed look at American coal supplies, I try to help people understand that our time frame for moving beyond coal is much closer to 20 years, putting climate change aside and all the reasons that we're concerned about the planet. If there was no climate change and no concern about mercury and no concern about coal ash and no concern about the health impacts of coal, our time frame for moving beyond coal is still much closer to 20 years than the 200 we've been told so often. Once again, our government is just plain gotten it wrong. We might realize that our government has just plain gotten it wrong in a number of areas lately. And in this case, the Energy Information Administration has been telling people we have 250 years of coal, but they have never analyzed that assessment for how much is actually accessible in any sort of economic or reasonable fashion. When you look at the geologic studies that have been done by the United States Geological Survey, you realize that way under 20% of this country's coal is going to be economically accessible. When you get down to the third level, EIA is flat wrong. United States USGS tells us under 20% is economically accessible. 20% of, say, 200 would be 40 years, but that you need to go one more step, which is to look at the coal mines in this country and get a sense for because coal comes from coal mines. It doesn't come from academic studies or EIA tables or anything like that. It comes from coal mines. When you actually look at coal mines, you realize that whether you're looking at the state level or whether you look at the mine-specific level in Wyoming, where 40% of our country's coal comes from, you realize that these coal mines are facing unbelievably serious constraints. And those are already really quite apparent to anybody who's looking. The problem is almost no one is looking because everyone assumes we have 200 years of coal. But if you start looking, you realize that the costs of coal are mounting quickly. You realize that coal is not showing up at coal plants, even though the coal plant has contracts. You realize, like my utility in Colorado, the price that they expect to pay for coal next year, the year 2010, is the price that last year they predicted they'd be paying in the year 2042. So the folks that are in charge are just completely using the wrong frame for looking at coal, because my utility was off by 3 decades in what they plan to do. And when we ask them, what analyses have you done of your long-term coal supply, the answer comes back repeatedly. We have it in writing in these very legal formats. We've done no analysis of our long-term coal supply. We have no such thing. And so it's very important that our country come to understand that, because if we drive over that cliff the way we've driven over the cliff with investment banking and the real estate industry and the big three and on, this is a cliff, this is the mother of them all, because we don't know how to function in this country without electricity. So we've got to wake up. This is going to require incredibly quick action. The good news is that once we wake up, then we'll start to align ourselves with what needs to be done to start reducing our carbon emissions and ultimately trying to stabilize carbon in the atmosphere, which is how I got started thinking so much about coal. The exciting part to me is that once we get the economic leaders as well as the political leaders, but once we get the CEOs of the big companies realizing if you want the lights on and all the equipment on in your factories and in your office buildings in the years 2020, you need to get to work. Because right now you think that coal is what's going to do it, but your utility hasn't analyzed your long-term, the chances are your utility hasn't analyzed long-term coal supplies. And when they do, they're going to realize that as some of them have, American Electric Power last year started to not have its coal show up, just as my utility started to not have its coal show up. So American Electric Power went out and just bought a coal mine, reported in the Wall Street Journal in June of this year, because they wanted to somehow try to manage that. I mean, of course you should be managing, you know, your supply chain. But utilities have done nothing for the most part to manage their supply chain of the most important fuel that keeps the lights on in the United States. And once the CEOs of large companies start to understand this, and they realize that if they want their companies to function in the year 2020, and that coal is not what's going to keep the lights on, the exciting part to me is that all of a sudden we will have CEOs of large companies saying we need to repower and we need to redo it quickly. And then that will drive what we've been talking about today at the next agenda conference, which is how can we get to 100% renewables. This conference was really driven by a desire to address climate change for the most part and to create green jobs and all the sorts of good things. I believe over the next 5 years, because the alternative is just unbearable to think about. So I believe that as the CEOs come to understand these coal supply constraints, they will also begin to call for a massive repowering in the next 10 to 15 years. And then I believe America will rise to the occasion, as we have time and time again, because the alternative is to fail monumentally and have our country fall into mass chaos. Because the coal trains, you can't print coal the way we've been printing money, right? So we've got to anticipate it. We've got to start looking for alternatives. We've got to start recognizing the monumental wind and solar resources we have in this country. We've got to build the transmission system that'll allow us to do it. We've got to create feed-in tariffs or whatever it is to maximize distributed energy, which will help to stabilize the grid. And then we've got to build all those wind turbines and solar thermal plants and photovoltaic panels and thin film and, you know, the cool earth, solar, cool, very cool, kind of call them party balloons, which is a concentrating photovoltaic system. And when we start to do all that, we will once again really re-energize our economy. As long as we think we have a 200-year platform to work from, we're going to go much too slowly. But the good news and the bad news is that we've backed ourselves into a very serious corner. If we wake up now, we can get it done in 10 to 20 years. If we kind of puddle along, we will go over that cliff too, and that's just a thought that's unbearable. So I personally am determined, you ask whatever, and I personally am determined to make sure my country doesn't drive over this cliff. In the case of coal supply constraints, it's largely at this point a public information campaign because so few people understand it. So many people are just saying, well, EIA, and then everybody gets into the echo chamber and everybody says we've got 200 years of coal. They don't know anything about it. They don't know where the coal comes from. They don't know 40% comes from northeastern Wyoming, which is the Powder River Basin. They don't know that there's only 13 mines really in the Powder River Basin. They don't know that all the major mines in the Powder River Basin have most of them have less than a 10-year lifespan. This is 40% of our country's coal, and the major mines have less than a 10-year lifespan. People don't understand that. And when that sinks in, and you start to realize, I mean, California's going to be fine, and Colorado's probably going to be fine, but what about Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and Missouri and Arkansas, where they're not ahead of the game the way California is? And that these coal supply constraints, you know, you just can't make a coal train show up. It just doesn't just sort of, you know, fall out of the sky, and you can't print it. People have been so misled once again by improper information from our government. And it was not any big conspiracy, it's just gross, I don't quite want to call it incompetence, but it's just a gross lack of assessing your data and really looking carefully at what it's founded on. And I've written a long report. It's available on our website, cleanenergyaction.org. It has over 200 high-quality references. It's called Coal, Cheap and Abundant, or Is It? Why Americans Should Stop Assuming That They Have a 200-Year Supply of Coal. It's all available for free download at cleanenergyaction.org. All the references are hyperlinked, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can go precisely to this hyperlink. I tell you to turn to page 20, and you will find all of the diagrams that I've... So it's thoroughly referenced, and I'm praying, again, that the titans of industry, so to speak, who want to keep the lights on, will take a very careful look at that and then, frankly, join this chorus to repower the United States. Get us a 21st century electric system. Nationally, about 50% of our electricity comes from coal, because there are some states like Washington and Oregon and Idaho where you get almost all of your electricity from hydro, and California gets a lot from nuclear and natural gas. So you kind of pull the national percentage down because you're kind of on a different scheme than the other 47 or 46 states in the country, most of whom, Colorado, we're about 70% coal. As you go to other states like Indiana, you're going to be up maybe around 80% coal. So the states that need to worry about it the most are the most dependent on coal, and frankly they're the farthest behind in making the transition that California has led the way on. Colorado's done some good work. We've got a long ways to go. But they really haven't done the work in efficiency the way California has. They haven't really worked on a renewable portfolio standard or a feed-in tariff or something like Colorado has done, where we have now kind of moved outside of California. We're near the top of the pack in both wind and solar. It's still kind of pitiful where we are, but we have the mechanisms in place. Our utility understands wind, our utility understands solar, our utility is beginning to understand efficiency, and in 10 years from now, I'm not very concerned about Colorado. I am monumentally concerned about places like Ohio and Indiana and Missouri and Arkansas, because they haven't done any of this preliminary work, and they're extremely dependent on coal. And they don't have the natural solar and wind resources that other states have. So they're going to have to really scramble if we're going to keep the lights on in, I always say Ohio, but it could be any of those Midwestern states. If we're going to keep the lights on there in the 2020s, we have got to start like so fast. We have got to move so fast. Coal is a solid. It's not a liquid or gas. You can't just kind of find a better way to suck it out the way we have with oil and gas. It's a solid. You've got to move dirt. There's no great high-tech way to frankly move dirt. And what has been keeping our country going is this massively increasing production out of Wyoming. Wyoming are surface mines. I refer to them as kind of fast-release coal. You can think about, you know, carbohydrates and the slow release and the fat, you could eat. What we've done in Wyoming is kind of the equivalent of eating 2 dozen donuts for breakfast. It powers you up really fast. But when those donuts are gone, thunk, you're done. And our production out of Wyoming has been increasing. Every other state that produces coal, except for Montana, has peaked already. Most of them peaked at the end of last century. Some of them peaked at the beginning of this century. Just done the analysis. But the only one that's been going up is Wyoming, because those are surface mines, and we've been able to take monumental, over 50 train loads of coal a day going out of Wyoming that keep 40% of our country's coal plants running. And that's been sort of this, we just ramped it up very quickly in the 80s and the 90s to make up for both our voracious demand for electricity and for the fact that coal in every other state, the production was either declining or about to start declining. So we kind of had this short-term fix. There's only 13 mines. They have less than a 10-year lifespan. They may be able to get a next round of expansions. The coal is owned by the federal government, not by Peabody or Arch or the big coal companies. And so that gives us 15 to 20 years if we're lucky.